Today I'm going to be talking about progressive presidents. This is also part two of the progressive era. First, Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was a great progressive governor of New York from 1899 to 1900 until he actually became the vice president for McKinley. McKinley actually got shot and died, so Roosevelt became the youngest president ever in U.S. history when he was 42. Theodore Roosevelt was a champion of reform. He dismantled trusts, pushed for new regulatory laws, settled labor disputes, and tried to conserve American nature. He believed presidents had the duty to guide national and geo/political affairs. Theodore Roosevelt's approach to domestic issues was called the Square Deal. The Square Deal was an idea where he would treat the concerns of the working class and capitalists equally and fairly. Instead of sending troops to break up strikes, he would rather sit the leaders of the union and the business down, and talk out the issue without any violence needed. The Roosevelt Railroad/Consumer Protection Reform. Roosevelt was the first president to convince Congress to enact railroad reform laws. We had the Elkins Act in 1903, which punished railroads that granted rebates, which were special reduction in prices, to their favored customers. We have the Hepburn Act in 1906, which gave the Interstate Commerce Commission, the power to fix railroad rates for services and strictly limit free passes given out to businessmen and politicians. Roosevelt also persuaded Congress to pass consumer protection laws, such as the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food Drug Act in 1906. Roosevelt's conservation of nature. Roosevelt appreciated the beauty of nature, so he fought hard for conservation, which led to two new laws. We had the Newlands Reclamation Act in 1902, which stated that money that came in from selling western desert land should be used for financing irrigation projects. We also have the Inland Waterways Act in 1907. It created a commission to study the use of the nation's major rivers. Roosevelt also used the Forest Reserve Act to establish over 100 national forests. Roosevelt was aided by Gifford Pinchot, I think this is how you say his names, Gifford Pinchot and John Muir. Pinchot was the head of the National Forest Service, and John Muir helped establish a lot of national parks. Roosevelt and quote-unquote trust busting. Roosevelt was the first president to actually enforce the Anti-Sherman Act of 1890. People were shocked when he announced that he was trying to prosecute Northern Security Company, which was a big holding company at that time. Roosevelt went on to break up more business companies like the Standard Oil Company. Because of this, he was known as a trust buster. Roosevelt was actually not an enemy of big business. He said that he only went after companies that he considered quote-unquote unfair. Controversy under Howard Taft. After his two terms, Roosevelt chose Taft as the Republican nominee, so Taft easily becomes president. Taft was super aggressive with trust busting, but progressives actually got mad when he started leaning more to the conservative side of the Republican Party. For example, Taft did not lower tariffs. In fact, he increased some tariffs with the Payne-Aldrich tariff. He created a split in the Republican Party, which was conservatives versus progressive Republicans. Roosevelt got super mad at him when he fired Gifford Pinchot, remember, who helped Roosevelt with conservation. So, Roosevelt, for the 1912 election, decided to run for a third term against Taft. But Roosevelt actually lost the Republican nomination to Taft, so him and his supporters created the Bull Moose Party. So, the election of 1912. There were four candidates: Roosevelt, Taft, Woodrow Wilson, and Eugene Debs. Woodrow Wilson ran for the Democratic Party, and he was a progressive governor in New Jersey. Eugene Debs ran for the Socialist Party. The Socialist Party championed interests of industrial workers and proposed radical ideas that all major industries should be controlled and run by the government. All of the four candidates claimed to be reformers. This was a sign that the nation was eager for reform. Wilson won with 435 electoral votes, largely due to Taft and Roosevelt splitting the Republican vote, and Rip Debs, he got no votes. The Woodrow Wilson presidency from 1913 to 1921. Wilson was only the second Democrat to be elected after the Civil War. Wilson wanted to establish his plan of quote unquote new freedom. New freedom would establish sweeping economic reforms that included lower tariffs, more effective regulation of big business, and a reformed system of banking. We have the Underwood Tariff in 1913, which lowered the cost of imported goods and removed protections that big businesses had. We have the 16th Amendment in 1913 as well, which gave Congress the power to tax income. And this was considered democratic at first because it only taxed the rich, and it was a graduated income tax. We have the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914. This greatly strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act. It stated that businesses could not grow through holding companies, people could not be on the board of directors for multiple companies, companies could not work together to fix prices, and labor unions could be not charged as monopolies anymore. We also have the Federal Trade Commission Act in 1914. It created the Federal Trading Commission, which had the power to inspect possible unfair business practices and could issue orders demanding companies to cease and desist from acting in illegal ways. Wilson and the Federal Reserve System. Before Wilson, there was no federal system for expanding and contracting national supply of currency. Wilson recognized that a growing industrial nation needed an organized banking system. Pre-Wilson, private banks often didn't hold enough currency, which led to a situation where if many people withdrew money at once, banks would actually go bankrupt and the nation would go into an economic depression. So, Wilson created the national system of central banks called the Federal Reserve System. Private banks kept cash reserves in 12 federal regional banks. A policy for banks were made by the Federal Reserve Board. They determined the interest rates for loans and how much currency was held in each bank. Banks could actually give out loans with interest, and the board could sell bonds or buy bonds from banks in order to increase or decrease the amount of money banks had available to lend out. So the big idea of the Federal Reserve System was that the Federal Reserve System, by using financial weapons such as lowering increased interest rates, setting reserve requirements, and purchasing bonds from banks, could contract or expand the supply of currency. So, the US government now had the power to influence the national economy. Wilson and democracy. In 1913, the 17th Amendment was passed, which required senators to be elected by the voters of the state, and this helped reduce big business influence on the selection of senators. In the 19th Amendment, women finally gained the right to vote nationwide. But Wilson and racial issues. Wilson was very progressive, but he was not concerned with the civil rights of African Americans, and he actually segregated federal building washrooms. World War I and big business. During World War I, big businesses and the government had to work together to produce the greatest amount of war supplies possible, which led to less strict business regulations. And post-war, the public didn't really care about regulation of big business; they just wanted mass goods. So presidents after Wilson promoted conservative rather than progressive policies. This would spawn a new age of laissez-faire economics.